Welcome in, everybody. Ready to dive into some fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Today, we're taking a look at Chris Butler, or as his followers know him, Jagat Guru Siddhasaropananda Paramahamsa.
Quite a name.
It is. And the organization he founded, the Science of Identity Foundation, or CEF for short.
So what is CEF exactly?
Well, based on what we've got here, it seems to be an offshoot of the Hare Krishna movement,
Okay.
big on bhakti yoga and meditation. But we're going deeper than that. We're going to hear what former members have to say, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
And let me tell you, it gets pretty intense.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about some heavy stuff, folks.
Yeah.
Former members using words like shattering of faith, betrayal, even spiritual damage to describe their experiences.
It's clear this wasn't just a casual, didn't enjoy the vibe kind of thing. There are some deep wounds here.
Absolutely. And one of the things that keeps popping up is this stark contrast between Chris Butler's teachings, especially about non-attachment, and, his alleged lifestyle.
Yeah, like one person remembers Butler having this extravagant multi-course meal while the devotees got like the most basic food imaginable.
Wow, that's quite the difference. Makes you wonder if they're really practicing what they preach, at the top.
For sure. And it's not just about material stuff either. There are tons of stories about Butler being controlling, even verbally abusive towards his followers.
Like one person said Butler told them to get the hell out of Hawaii and go back to New Zealand. That's a crazy level of control over someone's life. Kind of scary, if you ask me.
It really shows the power he seemed to have over people. And it's not just one isolated incident. Lots of people talk about feeling trapped, like they couldn't make even simple decisions without his say-so.
You can really see from these stories how much influence CEF had on its members. But we need to dig deeper. What were they actually doing that led to this kind of control? Psychic sleep is a term that comes up a lot.
Psychic sleep is an interesting concept, to say the least. Some former members describe these sessions as being almost hypnotic.
I see. And what was the supposed purpose of these sessions?
Well, according to some, they were meant to help people reach a deeper level of spiritual awareness, but others felt manipulated and controlled during these sessions.
So it sounds like the intent versus the impact is kind of, up for debate. But whatever the intention was, the effects on former members are obvious, right? Many of them say they struggled to fit back into society, even questioned their ability to think critically after leaving.
That's a big deal. If the goal was spiritual enlightenment, why are so many people describing psychological harm? It seems like a disconnect between what they were promised and what they actually experienced.
Yeah, that's a troubling inconsistency for sure. Something we should definitely look into further. But before we get too deep into the psychological effects, let's talk about the more practical side of things, the material consequences.
Right, because these accusations against CEF go beyond just psychological stuff. People are also claiming financial exploitation. Former members talk about working long hours on CEF projects but getting little to no pay, basically free labor.
One person wrote about spending years of their life on CIF's publications, only to feel used and broke in the end. That's a serious accusation.
It is. It suggests that CIF might have taken advantage of its members' dedication for its own benefit.
Exactly. We're not just talking about philosophical differences here. This is about real-life consequences for people lost time, lost money, maybe even damaged relationships. And it adds another layer to this whole picture of control and exploitation that's emerging from these accounts.
Absolutely. There's a pattern here, people giving their all to CIF, their time, their resources, and then walking away feeling betrayed and lost. It's a reminder that even when we're seeking spiritual growth, critical thinking and healthy skepticism are essential.
Couldn't agree more. Blind faith without a critical lens can make anyone vulnerable to manipulation, whether it's emotional, psychological, or like we're seeing here, financial.
For sure. So we've established that former CEF members have some serious complaints. But to really understand the impact of this organization, I think we need to get into their personal stories. What was it like to be a part of CEF, and what led them to leave?
I'm with you. Hearing it straight from the source will give us a much better understanding of how CIF operated, how it affected its members, and ultimately, what lessons we can all learn from their experiences.
Reading these stories from former CIF members is really something else.
It really is. One person talks about joining CIF when they were young, looking for, something more in life. They were drawn to Butler's personality, the whole community vibe of CIF.
Yeah, that desire for purpose, for belonging, it's a common theme in a lot of these stories. It kind of makes people more susceptible to the appeal of a group like CIF, a place that offers a sense of direction, a path to enlightenment.
Right. At first, this person felt like they had found that in CIF, they were dedicated to Butler's teachings, followed all the rules, put all their time into CIF projects.
It's like that initial feeling of fulfillment. You hear it a lot in stories about cults, right? But the thing is, it doesn't usually stay that way. What we need to understand is how that feeling can turn into something much more controlling over time.
And that's exactly what happened to this person. They slowly became isolated from their family and friends, discouraged from pursuing their own interests, even pressured to donate a big chunk of their income to CIF.
That gradual isolation, it's a classic tactic of undue influence. It's like a slow squeeze, you know? It makes it harder and harder for the person to realize they're being controlled.
And when this person finally started to question Butler's teachings and the practices of CIF, they were met with hostility, accusations of disloyalty, told that their doubts were a sign of weakness, bad karma, that kind of thing.
A classic way to silence dissent in these groups. Instead of encouraging open discussion, questions are twisted into personal attacks, making the leader seem even more powerful. It's a vicious cycle.
It's really sad to read about the struggle this person went through. They felt stuck between wanting to be a good devotee and this growing unease with what CEF was demanding of them. It's something we see a lot in these stories.
That internal conflict really highlights the sneaky nature of this type of control. It's not always about force, it's about subtly undermining the person's confidence, making them doubt themselves.
Another former member, someone who was deep into CIF's political activities, shared a pretty chilling story about how Butler allegedly used his influence to sway their political views. They felt pressured to support specific candidates and policies, even when they didn't personally agree.
This is where things get really serious. We're moving beyond personal spiritual stuff into potentially much wider political influence.
It's disturbing to think that an organization with these controversial practices might have a hand in politics. What does it say about how far CIF's reach might be?
It's definitely concerning, and it highlights how important it is to understand how these groups work, what dangers they might pose, not just to individuals, but to society as a whole.
One of the things that really stood out to me was how Butler allegedly used his teachings on non-attachment to justify breaking up families, saying that attachment to family was a worldly distraction, something that holds you back spiritually.
It's a disturbing twist on a concept that, in most spiritual traditions, is about finding inner peace, letting go of material things, not about cutting off loving family ties.
Right. And the effect this teaching had on families in CIF was devastating. We're seeing tons of stories about parents separated from their children, siblings turned against each other, all for the sake of reaching a supposed higher spiritual state.
This is where that whole psychic sleep thing gets even creepier. If those sessions were used to influence people's thoughts and actions, as some former members claim, then it's possible they played a part in breaking down family structures within CIF.
That's scary to think about.
Yeah.
It adds another layer to the question of whether these practices were really meant for spiritual growth or for something much more sinister.
Exactly. And it shows why it's so important to think critically about the claims of any spiritual leader or group, especially when those claims come at the cost of basic human connections.
It's clear from these personal accounts that CIF had a huge, often harmful impact on its members. But what about afterwards? How have these people coped with the psychological and material consequences of their time in CIF?
That's where you really see the resilience of the human spirit. Many of these folks have shown incredible courage and strength in rebuilding their lives.
One person described leaving CIF like waking up from a dream. They had to relearn everyday skills, get back on their feet financially, and reconnect with family and friends they had been separated from.
That feeling of disorientation, having to start over, it's a common experience for people who leave cults. It shows how much disruption these groups can cause in people's lives.
But even with all the challenges, there's also a sense of liberation, of empowerment. A lot of former members talk about finally being free to think for themselves, to make their own choices, and to live by their own values.
It's amazing that they were able to break free from this controlling environment and reclaim their lives. It's a powerful message of hope for anyone who might be going through something similar.
But it's important to remember that healing takes time. It's not always easy. Many former members are still dealing with the psychological scars of their time in CIF. They talk about struggling with trust, anxiety, and a lingering sense of guilt and shame.
That's why it's so crucial to offer support and understanding to people who have left these kinds of groups. Their experiences are valid, their pain is real. They need a safe space to heal, to process what they've been through, and to rediscover themselves.
We've explored the personal stories of former CIF members, their experiences within the group, their struggles to leave, and their journeys of healing and recovery. But I think there's one big thing we haven't fully addressed yet. The organization's alleged connection to politics, particularly the Gabbard family.
Yeah, that's where our deep dive takes a particularly interesting and potentially alarming turn. We're getting into the realm of political influence, where the stakes are much higher and the consequences could be much bigger.
We've already touched upon the stories of former members feeling pressured to support specific political candidates and policies. But to really understand this connection, we need to look closer. What do we have that tells us about the nature and extent of CIF's involvement in politics?
I think it's important to start by acknowledging that the connection between Sif and the Gabbard family, especially Tulsi Gabbard, is well documented.
You're right, Tulsi Gabbard's parents were deeply involved in CIF, and she herself grew up in the organization.
Right. Now, just having a connection doesn't necessarily mean anything shady was going on. But what raises concerns are the allegations of Sif being directly involved in political campaigns. We have sources claiming that Sif members were mobilized to volunteer for Gabbard campaigns, which could have given them a big advantage in terms of manpower and grassroots support.
That's a serious claim. If it's true, it suggests that CIF might have played a much bigger role in political campaigns than anyone realized.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, was this support just a reflection of what individual members believed? Or was it something more organized, directed by CIF leadership to influence the outcome of elections?
That's the question, isn't it?
Hmm.
And to answer it, we need more than just stories. Are there any financial records or internal documents that shed light on CIF's political activities?
That's where things get tricky. There have been allegations of CIF channeling money into political campaigns, but finding solid proof has been tough.
That lack of transparency is definitely worrying. If CIF is really all about ethical behavior, wouldn't they want to be completely open about their political activities?
You would think so. Transparency is crucial, especially for groups that claim to be all about spirituality and ethical living.
So we've got a documented connection between CIF and the Gabbard family, allegations of CIF members being used in political campaigns, and a lack of transparency about their finances. That's not a good look.
It's not. It definitely points to a pattern of influence that needs further investigation.
But even if we say that CIF did have a hand in political campaigns, does that automatically mean they were trying to force their beliefs on everyone?
That's the tough question, right? It's hard to prove intent, but the evidence we have definitely raises concerns about the possibility of CIF's teachings and practices influencing political decisions.
And knowing what we know about the allegations of control and manipulation within CIF, that's a scary thought.
It is. The idea of a group with such controversial practices potentially shaping political outcomes is a big deal. It highlights the need for us to be vigilant, to think critically, and to hold those in power accountable, regardless of their spiritual beliefs.
This whole deep dive has been quite a ride, hasn't it? From the emotional stories of former members to the disturbing allegations of political maneuvering, it's clear that CIF is a complicated and controversial organization, one that's had a major impact on its members, and maybe even on the political landscape.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this exploration, I think it's important to take a step back and think about what we've learned and what this all means in a bigger sense.
Man, we've really gone deep on this one, haven't we? From those incredibly personal stories from former CEF members to the whole political side of things, it's been a lot.
It has. And I think what makes this whole thing so fascinating, so important to talk about, is that it gets at these really basic questions about faith, belief, and how people can be manipulated, especially in spiritual groups.
Yeah, for sure. We've seen how Butler's teachings, especially about non-attachment and family, seem to have created this environment where control and exploitation could thrive.
Right. And what's really striking is how those teachings clash with what we hear about Butler's own life and actions. All this talk about simple living while he's allegedly having these fancy meals, families being torn apart in the name of spiritual unity. It's a tough pill to swallow.
It is. It makes you wonder, how can a doctrine that emphasizes non-attachment be used to justify such controlling behavior?
Well, I think it comes down to how the doctrine is interpreted and enforced. In CIF, it seems like non-attachment was less about personal growth and more about blindly obeying Butler.
So are you saying they were detaching from their own families and support systems just to become more attached to Butler and the organization?
Exactly. It's like trading one dependence for another, and that kind of power imbalance makes it almost impossible to question the leader, even when things start to feel off.
Man, it just goes to show that even the most positive ideas can be twisted and used for the wrong reasons.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to approach any belief system, whether it's spiritual or not, with a critical eye. It's not about throwing faith out the window. It's about balancing it with healthy skepticism and a strong sense of who you are.
So for someone listening who might be thinking about all this, maybe even questioning their own involvement in a spiritual group, what are some red flags to look out for?
That's a great question and an important one. First off, be careful of groups that demand complete obedience to one leader, especially if that leader claims to have special or exclusive knowledge.
What about groups that encourage you to cut ties with family and friends? We saw how harmful that was with CEF.
Huge red flag. Healthy spiritual communities should support your existing relationships, not try to replace them.
Another thing that stuck out from those forum posts was how Butler would supposedly shut down any kind of disagreement or criticism.
That's a classic sign of a controlling group. A healthy group should encourage open and respectful discussion. If your questions are met with anger or accusations of disloyalty, that's a bad sign.
And it's not just about what they say, it's how they say it. Using insults, personal attacks, or guilt trips. Those are all manipulation tactics.
Exactly. True spiritual guidance should lift you up and empower you, not tear you down or control you. If you feel like you're being manipulated or pressured, trust your gut.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Chris Butler and CEF, I think the takeaway is pretty clear. Spiritual exploration is a good thing, but it's crucial to do it with your eyes wide open.
I couldn't agree more. Trust your intuition, ask questions, and don't be afraid to walk away from anything that feels wrong.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and maybe even some things to think about as you continue on your own path.
Remember, true spiritual growth is a journey, and it's best traveled with an open heart and a critical mind.